What's up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Young Guns podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the Pittsburgh Penguins and whether or not we believe that they're going to make the playoffs by the end of this season. You know, it's been a tough race in the Eastern Conference and a very tight race in the Eastern Conference currently. We've already talked about the Islanders. We've already talked about the Detroit Red Wings. You know, we are on the verge of talking about the Pittsburgh Penguins, and we will also be talking about the Philadelphia Flyers, and we've also talked about the Washington Capitals already. So now we're hopping into Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh's been an interesting case pretty much all season. All eyes was on them at the beginning of the year. You know, when they acquired Erik Karlsson, everyone was like, okay, this is a year that Pittsburgh is starting to, bring it back. They're going to build a juggernaut. They're going to be able to be that team that's going to bring themselves back into the playoffs, and they're going to give Crosby and Malkin another opportunity at a cup. And it just kind of hasn't been what I think everyone expected Pittsburgh to be this season. They've really struggled at times. You know, they've had long losing streaks. They've had bad goaltending. They have had, to some extent, bad coaching even in certain situations this season. But they're somehow still in the hunt, and they're somehow still there, and they're only 3 points out of a playoff spot, and 4 points out of third place in the Metropolitan Division. So the hope is still alive for Pittsburgh Penguins fans, but the question becomes, is this team going to be able to do it? And if they do it, how much damage are they realistically going to make in the playoffs? Because, like I said before, they haven't been all that impressive this season. And, the biggest story as well, they don't have Jake Gensel, who was traded to the Carolina Hurricanes at the trade deadline as Pittsburgh was trying to sell off some assets because they didn't believe they were going to get there. What's going to happen in this situation, Zach? Do you think the Penguins are in it? Do you think they're going to make it? Or do you think, the dream's going to fall just short for Penguins and for their fans?
I'm a big believer in this later stage of the season magic orchestrated by Sid the Kid, Gino Malkin, and the rest of the group. I think they're going to make the playoffs this year.
Really?
I think I could confidently say that they're on a bit of a run right now. They've won 4 out of the last 5 games, currently playing in a 4-point game essentially against the Caps, division rival, fighting for a wild card spot, if not a Metropolitan Division spot. They're up right now in that game. It looks like it's still 2-0 about in the second period, and they've been on a heater lately. They've been playing great hockey. Crosby's been playing amazing. You're getting secondary scoring from Rickard Rakell. Erik Karlsson has been producing all season, and he's producing to this moment right now. Nedeljkovic has been playing really well for them, and he's overall had a very above average season. He's played so far in 31 games. Tristan Jarry has been the starter, but Tristan Jarry has been very inconsistent despite the fact that he has 6 shutouts this year. In a lot of other games, he's been basically not great at all. Yeah, but if you look at like this team's, if you break down their game to numbers, this is a team that's for the most part this year has been average in scoring. They struggle on the power play, which is surprising considering the amount of stars and experienced players they have among this group. But if you look at their defensive stats, they're a team that's really good. They're the number 1 face-off team in the league. So most off of most start of plays, they're starting with the puck more often than not. This is a team that doesn't get a lot of penalties, so that means they're well coached. They've been a good team. They've always had a positive goal differential this year, but the record wasn't reflecting it. If correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they started the first 15 games of the season only amounting to about 5 or 6 wins. And that was a very disappointing start for them, considering the fact that there were high expectations. They acquire Erik Karlsson, they add him to their veteran core, and a very aggressive move by the newly hired GM Kyle Dubas. And the message that they were sending across the league and to their fan base is that we want we want another crack at this with Sid the Kid before him and Malkin and Letang are gonna pack it up. We want another run at this, and they went for the reigning Norris Trophy winner and Erik Karlsson, and it's just things on the ice haven't gone their way. There's been criticism towards their scoring, towards the fact that maybe Erik Karlsson wasn't the right move. Maybe they could have got another type of defenseman, as he has similar characteristics to somebody like Chris Letang, who's already on the team, or maybe they could have invested that capital and acquire another forward to supplement this group. But here we are now, post-trade deadline. They were kind of like a meh team going into the deadline, and not a lot of moves, or any, were really made to up this group. They got Michael Bunting by default because there had to be some cap going the other way in the Carolina deal. They got some much needed assets. So they bring in Michael Bunting. They lose Jay Gensel, who is I believe he was their second top scorer on the team after Sid the Kid, until that trade happened. And so they had a worse group leaving the trade deadline. Now they're in a situation where they've been getting results down the stretch. They've been getting kind of the situational luck that they weren't getting when they were playing even better to start the year. And I think this is a group that now it is not too late in the regular season for them to pick it up and secure a playoff spot. I think they will be doing that very, very shortly.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about, what you mentioned as well is, yes, they bring in Erik Karlsson this season to kind of bolster their team and to make them, basically in this case, one of the best teams in the league, because, you look at a team with Sidney Crosby on it and Jake Gensel at the beginning of the year and Brian Rust and Evgeny Malkin, and you're saying to yourself, that power play is going to be the best. And then they go and they're probably one of the worst power plays in the league, if not the worst power play in the league right now, or, definitely bottom five. And it hasn't been good all year. So that's definitely been a big problem when it comes to, trying to win games and being able to be in that hunt. I think for the Penguins this season, they've kind of been that weird team. You look at a team that is 12th in the league in goals against, they're 22nd in the league in goals forward. This is a team that, has had good goaltending for parts of the season. Like you mentioned, Tristan Jarry's got 6 shutouts. Nedeljkovic has 1. Jarry's kind of struggled at times this season. 19 wins, 24 losses, 5 overtime losses, whereas Nedeljkovic has, 14 wins, 6 losses, 6 overtime losses. He's been the better of the two. But in some cases, I think Jarry's had a really interesting season because, yes, he hasn't been at his best, but I also believe that to some extent, the Penguins haven't provided him with enough scoring in front of him in order for him to win more games. I think that, when a goalie's got 6 shutouts on the season, I think to some extent you have to look at the team in front of him and say, is he winning these games because the team in front of him is playing well, or is he winning these games because he genuinely has to steal them? And in some cases, I think with Jarry, and even to some extent with Nedeljkovic at times this year, I think they've had to, step up and be big players for them in order for the Penguins to get some wins. With that being said, I've always looked at this in a certain situation, and for me, it's always been about how far the Penguins are going to go, is how far Sidney Crosby is going to take them. And he's been a fantastic player for them this season. He's the main reason they're in this race to begin with. And in my opinion, I think we talk about guys that deserve to win the Hart Trophy. I don't think Sidney Crosby gets enough credit for the season that he's having, and I understand that 84 points, 75 games. Considering, some of the superstars around the NHL and what they're doing, is not necessarily that impressive. I think the fact that Sidney Crosby is single-handedly pretty much taking a team on his back and basically saying, I'm going to, try to bring you guys to the playoffs because I want to win a cup, I think is incredible, especially at 36 years of age, to do what he's doing. And then, you haven't really had the production from Malkin that you would like. Yes, he's got 59 points in 75 games. He's likely going to hit 65 by the end of the year in points. For a 37-year-old center, that's not that bad. And again, he's playing like a second-line center, but he's not the same player he once was. You lose a big name in Jake Gensel. You replace him with Michael Bunting, who's been decent for the Penguins in 14 games, 9 points for him. He's been pretty good. And then, yes, there was a big loss in Brian Rust with 50 points in 55 games this season so far. He's been a big part. But I think the Penguins have expected more from guys like Riley Smith, Rickard Rakell, Erik Karlsson, and Chris Letang. I think the problem with this team is that it kind of, and you see it here, after Crosby, Malkin, and now Brian Rust, and then, Karlsson and Letang, it kind of drops off, right? Like Riley Smith, only 12 goals. Rickard Rakell, 13 goals. Drew O'Connor's got 13 goals, right, in 72 games, but he's more of a fourth-line player. Lars Eller, 14 goals, but again, he's more of a fourth-line player, and he kind of plays on the second-line power play. They haven't gotten, let's say, production from guys that they've needed to get production from. Guys like Riley Smith, guys like Rickard Rakell, guys like Karlsson and Letang. I understand that Karlsson, is coming off a Norris Trophy winning season, but, he's arguably on a better power play than he was in San Jose. He's playing, big minutes for them, and he only has 47 points in 75 games. Like, that's not good enough for Erik Karlsson standards for a guy who's averaging about 24 minutes a night with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And then you have Chris Letang, who, yes, he's had his role diminished this season, because of the fact that, he hasn't always been on the first power play unit. That takes a toll for him. And, yes, he's also playing against the toughest competition at 36 years old. But even him, I think they've expected better from him in terms of offensive production, and they haven't gotten that. And I think that's the problem with the Pittsburgh Penguins is that, yes, you can rely on Sidney Crosby, but the reason they are where they are, or the reason they've been where they've been most of the season, is because they have not been able to find a way to win games when they've needed to. And the other issue is also they're an old team, right? They don't have a lot of young guys on their team. Like, I'm looking at the forward core right now, and just guys.
They don't have depth either. They don't have depth at the forward position at all. Jeff Carter is completely a shell of himself, and they don't have, because the thing is, like you touched on it, their secondary scoring is not what they expected it to be. They expected Riley Smith to be producing more. Same goes to Rickard Rakell. If you compare these two specific players to their previous performances in previous seasons, they weren't a half a point a game player. They were, by this time in the season, they'd both be fairly above the 50-point mark. And you saw it last year with Riley Smith for Vegas, and especially in the Stanley Cup playoffs. They're not getting enough from those guys.
He was a 56-point player with Vegas last year. Like to me, I think you're going from a 56-point player with Vegas to a 35-point player with Pittsburgh. It's just not good enough. And I understand, it's different competition and different, line mates and stuff like that. But that's a guy who, if Riley Smith has 50 points this season, we're having a different conversation, right? Like, I think Pittsburgh's comfortably in a playoff spot. I think if Rickard Rakell, who only has 32 points this year, like, if you look at his career stats and his career average, like last year, he had 60 points in 82 games. Right? Like, if Rickard Rakell can play even at a 50-point pace, which he's not even playing at right now. Yes, I know he's been injured, at times this season. Same thing with Riley Smith. But even at that, right? Like, if they can play a little bit better than what they're playing, and like if they were both at, closer to 45 or 50 points, if Rickard Rakell would add maybe, 4 or 5 more goals to his name and a couple more assists, and Riley Smith would add 4 or 5 more goals to his name and a couple of more assists. This is a team that, like I said, is comfortably in a playoff spot, and we're having a conversation about this team potentially, being an interesting team coming into the playoffs. But they're in this race and they're in this fight because, like you mentioned, they don't have the depth, right? They've lacked on that for a long time, and I think the fact is too, they're an older team as well. They don't necessarily have the young guys, the young talents. They have to rely on a lot of their veterans, and a lot of their veterans are at an age now where, they're not necessarily at the point where they need to be relied upon. Like you mentioned, Jeff Carter is basically on his last legs, right? Like, and then you have Lars Eller, who, yes, 27 points for a fourth liner is pretty good, but he's also 34 years old, right? So it takes into consideration that, like, you need better. Riley Smith, 32. Right? Rickard Rakell's, in the prime of his career. So there's a lot of situations here where I think Pittsburgh put themselves at a disadvantage. I think they haven't necessarily done a good job at building, let's say, the best team for them. But at the same time, I also think that some guys have underachieved this year. And I think when you're paying a defenseman, in this case, Erik Karlsson, $10 million, which, and you take him on for that many years, you expect him to have more than 47 points. And it's just not good enough. Like, he should be in the conversation with the top 5 defensemen in the league for most points, right? If Karlsson adds, even he's at 47 points now. If he was at 60 points this season, like if he would have added 13 more points to his name, I think the Penguins are comfortably in a playoff spot. And that's what it is. It's minuscule, situations that have put them in this position, right?
Well, it's getting the most out of the guys that you do have on your roster, because they, like we've been saying, there's a team with no depth. So the guys that they do have, the veteran core, they gotta hit. Like you gotta be getting the best hockey out of them. Look, it's not, the revelation this year is that this group, it's not the best construct of a team. I myself had high hopes for them when they added Erik Karlsson, but if you look at the numbers, his stat line is almost identical to Chris Letang. But these are two guys who have to split power play duties. Last year, that wasn't the case. Karlsson was getting almost the full 2 minutes because let's face it, there was a crappy San Jose team, and he won the Norris Trophy despite that, and had about over a point per game. He was at 100 points last year. So you go from having a guy who scored 100 points, relied on all the time when it comes to generating offense. He was the primary driver of offense. You throw him on this team, you say, okay, well, you're going to be splitting the top minutes with Chris Letang, and that goes for special teams, 5-on-5, and it doesn't work for a player like that. A player like Karlsson is a player who I saw this effect in Ottawa. He's a player who loves control, and who the faith of your team has to be in his hands. It's going to be to your detriment at times, but most of the time he's going to be the one who's going to take you over the hump. But he is somebody who wants peak accountability, and that's not what he's getting. He's thriving in his current role at Pittsburgh. Of course he is. He's Erik Karlsson, but they're not getting the most out of him, and they're not getting the most out of a lot of other guys. And if they don't make the playoffs, it's completely a shame to Crosby, who's having arguably the best season of all time for a 36-year-old player.
Yeah.
Is going to probably hit the 40-goal mark tonight or in the next couple of games here. So it's honestly a shame that if they miss the playoffs, then it could be that this is it for that group. I don't know what you can maybe touch on it a little bit more, but if this team doesn't make the playoffs, I could almost guarantee that Erik Karlsson is going to get traded, and this team is going to probably go into a full rebuild, and maybe Crosby's out the door, something like that.
I think you also have to take into consideration too, like Dubas made a big move when he traded Gensel at the deadline, right? Because this team wasn't out of it, and if you look at the Pittsburgh Penguins, and like I said before, any team that has Sidney Crosby on it is in until they're mathematically eliminated, right? And he made a big move. He basically made a statement to the team to basically say, look, we're not good enough. We're going to trade Jay Gensel. We're going to get assets for him. And that's why I believe, like you said, that if they don't make the playoffs, I think it's done for this core. And actually, I would even go as much as to say, even if they do make the playoffs, I think it's done for this group. I think the only way the Pittsburgh Penguins, don't, let's say, not rebuild, but retool their team, is if they go on a crazy deep playoff run. Like if, let's say, for example, right, Pittsburgh gets into the playoffs, right? Let's say the last seed, last wild card, they end up playing the Rangers in round 1. If they beat the Rangers and then go to the second round and go to a 7-game series with Florida or Boston, let's say as an example, or Carolina, and they go all the way to 7 and they lose by 1 goal, well, then I think you can have a different conversation and say, you know what, maybe this team wasn't as bad as we thought it was, right? Maybe there's minor pieces that need to be adjusted. We need to adjust our depth, but it's not as bad as we thought. But if this team comes into the playoffs and they get swept in 4 games, you played an additional 4 games, but your problems are still there, right? So
yeah,
a lot of things get patched up when you're in the playoffs, and a lot of truths come out when you're in the playoffs. And that's the biggest thing, I think, for teams in general, whether it's a team battling for a playoff spot or not, is a lot of these teams that are in the wild card standings right now, whether you're Philly, Washington, Detroit, Islanders, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, whoever it is, right? A lot of these teams are going to show their true identity once they get into the playoffs, because once you're in the playoffs, it's a different beast. And I think that out of all the teams that are there, the team with the most experience in the playoffs is Washington and Pittsburgh, right? Ovechkin and Crosby. So I think that Pittsburgh's going to make it. I think they're going to make it simply for the fact that if I look at their schedule, it says 2-0 right now, but I just checked before. It's actually 3-0 Pittsburgh currently. I don't know if it's going to update here. Yes, it does. So as you can see, it's 3-0 Pittsburgh right now against Washington as we're recording this. They have Tampa next, then Toronto, then they play Detroit, Boston, Nashville, and the Islanders. So Pittsburgh's got some interesting games because, this win, if they beat the Capitals, right, would put them at 81 points. It would be tied with the Islanders, who are also playing tonight against Columbus, right? But what this does is it now puts this race even better because Washington is now 1 point ahead of Pittsburgh with a game in hand. Philly, who are not playing tonight but are playing tomorrow, right, are going to literally be 2 points ahead of Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh's going to have a game in hand on them. So the race is going to come down to the wire. And I know Pittsburgh's got a tough schedule, but, they can probably beat one of Tampa or Toronto. That game against Detroit's going to be huge for them. And if they can win one against Boston or Nashville, I think that puts them in a really good position. So, they've gotten great goaltending from Nedeljkovic. They've gotten great goaltending from Tristan Jarry. But the feeling is from this team, and I know that I bashed them at some point during the year, but this is a team that looks like they're on their way to win 5 out of their last 6. They're on a heater right now. And, I'm the type of guy that I'm not going to bet against Sidney Crosby. I've learned the hard way betting against him. And I think, you know what? It's Sidney Crosby. And if there's one guy in the National Hockey League that I would put my money on to carry his team to the playoffs, it's Sidney Crosby. So I think they're going to do it.
Well, it didn't happen last year. Last year, arguably, they had a even easier path to the playoffs with a couple of games to go, and they lost a head-scratching game against Buddy
Chicago.
Robinson and the Chicago Blackhawks. And this year they have a tougher schedule because if you look at the list, it's all teams that are either in the playoff mix or that already have playoff spots. It's a great boost that they're currently winning the game against Washington tonight. It's a matter of closing it off. But then you get Tampa, Toronto. Doesn't matter if these teams already clinch and are in comfortable positions. These teams want to keep momentum going into the playoffs. We've touched on this before.
Right.
Detroit are going to be in the mix till the end. You got Boston, you got Nashville, and the Islanders could be another critical 4-point game to finish off their season. So they're going to be like literally in it until the end here. But out of the other teams that are in the mix, they're playing much better than those teams. And I do believe in. Right now. What was that? They're the only team that looks like they want it.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. It's the truth. They're the only team that looks like they want it, and although their schedule is tough, I think you know what it is. Pittsburgh's that team that plays better against better teams. Like I feel like if you put Pittsburgh in a building against Toronto, they're going to show up more than a team against Chicago. Like Pittsburgh's always been like that for some reason. They cannot seem to beat the teams that they're supposed to beat, which is weird. But they remind me a lot of what the Leafs were a couple of years ago, where like they would lose against teams like Arizona and like Chicago, but they would go beat like Tampa and Florida or Montreal to some extent too. That, for some reason, Montreal will play against teams that are probably of equal, let's say, talent of them, and they'll, lose like Florida or Boston or Tampa, or in most recent memory, even Toronto, and they've, been able to compete with them. So I think sometimes it's more of a mindset thing, and I think that it's probably better for Pittsburgh to play teams that are better than them, because I think it's going to show exactly what their identity is, and it's going to be able to show, okay, if we made the playoffs and we beat these teams to make the playoffs, then we deserve to be here, right? And that's kind of how I see it. Is like, look, if you're going to beat Tampa, Toronto, Boston, like during your stretch of games to make the playoffs, then you deserve to be there because you've done everything necessary to get there.
Yeah, so the cards are all in their hands right now. And look, if they close this season off with winning 5 out of 6 games, and then they play the Rangers or any other team, they'd be a force to reckon with going in with that much momentum, and that's
and they've been there before because Crosby's won 3 cups.
Of course, they have all the experience and all of the winning acumen on their side. This would be especially for a team that is desperate to have success in the playoffs. I'd be afraid of a team like Pittsburgh if that is the situation. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap things up here?
Just that playoff Karlsson is going to be a force to be reckoned with as well. If you know anything about him in Ottawa during that run with the Senators.
Actually, I know nothing about it.
No, I'm saying you, but I'm saying like for the fans that probably aren't familiar or who watched it or didn't watch it, Erik Karlsson in the playoffs is a different demon, man. So if the Penguins get in there and Erik Karlsson gets a chance to play in the playoffs, he steps his game up in the right moments, and sometimes that's what you need to get to the next step. So, besides that, Zach, is there anything you want to add before we close this off?
I mean, I hope we see the prime Erik Karlsson back in the playoffs. That's the only thing I'll have to add to that.
Is there any sponsors you would like to shout out before we leave at this video?
We're going to be shouting out Triple Diamond Collectibles, and we have another sponsor that we're going to be announcing in a future video, and you guys should be excited about that one. It's another hockey related sponsor, and we're going to be thrilled to be collabing with them as well. So for now, Triple Diamonds is going to be in the description section again. Once again, guys, thanks for watching this video. Please make sure to comment, follow our social media pages, and we'll be making more of these prediction videos as we head into the NHL playoffs in a couple of weeks' time. So this has been Zach
and Luca.
And Peace. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.